The room feels unchanged from any typical quiet space, as if nothing has ever disturbed its arrangement. The sunlight's position is a measurable but insignificant variation in an otherwise stable environment. The narration observes that shadow density fluctuates slightly without any meaningful cause. The narration registers the subtle shift in color temperature as a routine environmental variation. Reflective surfaces adjust continuously to ambient light without drawing attention. Time of day inference remains stable despite minor shadow extension. Airborne dust as a standard indicator of still indoor air. How material tones shift under constant illumination. The narration observes increased visibility of surface detail under higher luminance. The definition of the shadow's edge is a direct response to the intensity of the incoming light. The narration notes a minor reduction in global illumination. The beam contraction as a shift in external light angle. Highlight emergence as a function of directional light. The reduced contrast smooths the visual texture of the wood grain, making the shadows appear softer across the surface. The environmental light equilibrium is temporarily consistent. The narration records micro-shadow contraction under steady illumination. Minor luminance fluctuation at boundary surfaces. We are observing a fractional increase in the diffusion of the ambient lighting. The shadows are softening. The reflectivity decreases as the light angle changes. A slight darkening appears near the far corner of the room. This localized shadow accumulation occurs without structural change. The narration records increased surface legibility under directional illumination. Here we observe a state of perceptual equilibrium. The spatial lighting is perfectly balanced, with highlights and shadows existing in harmony. Central illumination concentration as a minor variance. The soft diffusion is returning across the room.
The environment appears stable enough that no variation stands out anymore.
The narration notes that spatial distance seems unchanged when measured, but subtly inconsistent when observed. The narration records this separation as a perceptual misalignment without physical confirmation. The perception of directional change in static material patterns. An observational inconsistency is registered as the space compresses. The distance between the narration notes softening edge clarity without optical cause. The shadow maintains its precise geometry, yet its position lags noticeably behind the shifting light source, demonstrating a clear delay in consistency. A shift in spatial reference alignment occurs without any physical change to the objects in the room. We are observing a perceived angular inconsistency in static geometry. Inverted brightness distribution without external cause. The uneven texture of the static surfaces gradually becomes visible, emerging in subtle, irregular patches across the wall. We observe a perceived reduction in the object's presence, occurring without any physical alteration. The narration records softened spatial boundaries. The apparent recentering occurred without displacement, as the object remained motionless throughout the observation period. The narration notes reversed temporal alignment in reflection behavior. The geometry is consistent, yet the chair's legs appear uneven by a minimal perceptual margin. The shadow beneath the chair is demonstrating intermittent coherence, detaching and reattaching subtly at the edges while the environment remains unchanged. The perceived distance between these floorboards fluctuates slightly, creating a visual ripple. The subtle expansion in the perceived geometry is now evident, though the structure remains unaltered. The wood grain appears to shift, demonstrating a directional inconsistency in texture perception. The narration notes reduced perceptual density in static space. Here we observe a curious phenomenon. The chair appears to anticipate the shifting light, suggesting an inverted temporal ordering in its perception of the environment. The narration records desynchronization between reflection and light. Although the room appears still, the perceived center of gravity has shifted, rendering the gravitational reference unstable. Transient perceptual echo without physical persistence.
The narration concludes that normal observation no longer fully restores a stable reference state.
We note a subtle disconnect between the physical framing and the perceived standpoint, as if the camera is not fully anchored. The room exhibits a subtle temporal lag, perceived through the unnaturally slow drift of dust motes in the light. This phenomenon has no measurable cause. The narration notes discontinuous illumination sampling in perception. The narration highlights the uneven temporal aging perception across these static objects, suggesting time accumulates differently across surfaces. The room remains visually consistent, yet the feeling of the present moment seems disconnected from the observed stillness.
The narration notes oscillating spatial perception independent of geometry.
The light does not smoothly transition, but rather steps up in discrete segments, mimicking a segmented perception. We observe a clear case of identity misalignment between the object and its projection on the floor. The sensation of depth within the room is beginning to flatten. This compression reduces the perceived distance between the chair and the far wall. A curious phenomenon. The source of the light remains fixed, yet the resulting shadows move independently. Despite the stillness of the image, the observer experiences a fractional offset in their sense of head position, a proprioceptive mismatch with the visual frame. The narration records re-indexing of spatial coordinates.
We must consider the reclassification of silence as a spatial property.
The narration notes a temporal inversion in relational observation, suggesting a reversal of causality as the chair persists before its shadow. The narration records weakening of spatial definition at periphery. There is a measurable delay, a subtle lag between the moment we observe something and the moment we fully acknowledge it. We are observing a case of weakening object permanence. The chair's existence appears conditional rather than fixed. The narration records delayed causality in visual response as the illumination slowly catches up to the window. The internal and external temporal references were decoupling, suggesting that time within the room was no longer synchronized with the outside world. The observation shifts. The chair no longer merely exists within the frame. It contains it. The observer's boundary begins to dissolve, blending seamlessly into the environment of the space itself. The sense of sequence between frames feels less reliable than the image itself. This indicates a degradation of temporal continuity perception. The centered chair and the steady light suggest an expectation. We are not merely observing the room. The observation itself is no longer a single continuous act, but a divided structure across time.
The erosion of temporal segmentation means earlier observations cannot be cleanly separated from the current frame.
Asynchronous light expectation embedded in perception. The observer's sense of gaze direction feels partially distributed, a fragmentation of focal awareness without physical camera movement. Observe the subtle reorganization of the floorboards. This demonstrates perceptual re-indexing of spatial order. The narration records overlapping positional interpretations of a single object. We observe the oscillation in spatial scaling perception. The perceived distance subtly alternates between near and far, without physical change. The narration notes collapse of perceived time length. Several moments observed in a single unresolved instance. The narration records residual light memory effect in perception. The room appears to slightly reassert its boundaries, recovering some definition. There is a partial rest. We are noting the bifurcation of observational identity. Note the reverse dependency between object and shadow perception. We are observing a non-physical inclination effect. While the environment remains stable, the spatial perception of the floor begins to subtly tilt downwards. We see the room as it is now, yet earlier scenes persist. These prior perceptual layers remain faintly present. The narration notes diffusion of directional origin in lighting perception. The narration notes layered object continuity across time perception. The fixed point of observation has dissolved. We are merely perceiving the space without a physical presence to ground the view. The semantic instability of spatial anchors is evident here, as the chair shifts between object and reference point. Silence is rarely absolute. Instead, it is a layered phenomenon, revealing its structure only upon close observation. The narration notes temporary alignment of observer-object spatial encoding. The structure appears to be undergoing a partial normalization. Yet, as observed, a degree of residual inconsistency persists. The sense of being in this moment feels thinner, as if less fully inhabited. This phenomenon is known as multi-state spatial perception collapse. If previous scenes feel less like memory and more like simultaneous background layers, then we are observing true concurrent temporal layering in cognition. The narration notes dissolution of observer separation threshold. Continuity is now perceived as circular rather than linear.